Okay, well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Can everybody see and hear me? You just nod, thank you, thank you. And Mr. Stanley will be with us later at 10 o'clock, as I understand. So, okay, great. So it's 9:30. It is time for me to begin this final hearing session for the examination into the soundness of the Ipswich Borough Local Plan Review. So today we will hopefully cover matter 8, which is development management policies, and also matter 9, the implementation and monitoring sections of the plan. So again, for the record, I've met everybody on screen, but for the record, my name is Mike Hayden. I'm a Chartered Town Planner, and I've been appointed with, jointly with Karen Baker, who's also a Chartered Town Planner. We've been appointed by the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government to hold this examination and to produce a report of our conclusions and recommendations with regard to soundness. Again, just a reminder, I'm sure everyone has, but if you could just ensure your mobile phones are switched to silent whilst the hearing session is on, and also if you could just ensure your microphones are muted until you're invited to speak. That way we can avoid disturbance from background noise or pinging phones or devices throughout the session. So thank you very much. Again, just to remind everybody, this session is being live streamed and recorded by the council. So again, the recording will be published shortly after the close of the sessions today on the council's YouTube channel with a link from the examination website for everyone to follow. And both Ms. Baker and I have observed that the recordings are there online and seem to be working well. So grateful to the council for that. As you know, Annette Feeney is our programme officer. So you've met Annette. Annette works for us, again, for the record. Thank you, Annette. Independently of the council, managing the administrative arrangements for the examination. We will come back to some sort of concluding matters in respect of next steps at the end of the sessions today. But just to say clearly, after today, any contact that you need to make with us as inspectors will need to be through Annette outside of the hearing sessions. Okay, in terms of the hearing sessions today, so again, we're following the guidance that we've sent to all parties and are published online. So our guidance note and also the etiquette note on virtual hearings procedures. We are programmed to sit for 3 sessions today and to finish no later than 3:30 p.m. So that's what I'm working towards. What I have done, as you'll have noticed, is I've issued just an updated agenda for today. And all I've done is to simply list all of the items for discussion as one and to work through them over the 3 sessions, rather than artificially break them into 3 separate sessions. That's why Annette invited all participants to join today for this first session. So my hope is that should make more efficient use of hearing time today, enable us to achieve a finish by 3:30. But just to confirm, we'll break at 11 o'clock and also at 1 o'clock for lunch as usual. But what I'll do is simply adjourn at an appropriate point in the agenda. So again, the hearing will be, today will be in the form of a structured discussion, which I'll lead following the agenda that we've circulated, and that agenda is based on the matters, issues and questions paper that we previously circulated. What I'll do is I'll invite people to speak at particular times. I think today, probably more so than at other times, there's more questions for the council than other participants, but please, if others wish to make a contribution, then if you can raise your hand at the appropriate point. If I can ask you to try and use the raise hand function Perhaps rather than raising your hand on screen, because what I wasn't doing yesterday was picking up the raised hands on screen, although I've said that's appropriate previously, but if you could use the raise hand function on Zoom, if possible, that would be very helpful. Ms. Baker may also have some questions as we go through, so just to let you know. We've asked that you keep your camera switched on for the entire session, so if you could please continue to do that, but with microphones muted until invited to speak. The only exception clearly is where there's more than one participant per representative, so as is the case for the council. Okay, we again, just as a reminder and for the record, just to say, participants should have already provided all of your evidence in your original representations. The hearings are not an opportunity to submit anything further in writing. Any comments that you make during the hearing session should therefore relate to points made in your original representations. And just to confirm again that we have read original representations and hearing position statements, so there's no need to repeat what's already said in those. The purpose again for today, as previously, is for us to seek clarification or further information on the outstanding questions we have. So, any questions on the procedures for today? Any questions on the updated agenda? Great. Okay. If I could ask then please for the parties to just introduce themselves again for the record. I recognise everybody, but just for the record, if we could have some introductions. So starting with the council, Ms. Tafur, do you want to just introduce your team? Thank you.
I will do. Thank you, sir. Good morning. My name is Isabella Tafur. I'm a barrister providing legal assistance to the Borough Council. And I have with me today Michael Hammond and Sarah Barker. And sir, just ask you to note that we have had a slight personnel change at the last minute. And so just asking for your indulgence if we may need just a little bit of extra time or on some of the topics, because Mr. Hammond has genned up very well, but late in the day.
That's fine. That's fine. And look, yeah, we understand, and yeah, we'll ensure that your team are given the opportunity to respond. And if they're unable to respond to questions here and now, then we're quite happy to for them to take things away and come back to us. So that's
Thank
fine.
you.
Okay, great. For the County Council, Mr. Clow, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Good morning, I'm Cameron Clow. I'm a Senior Planning Officer at Suffolk County Council, and I'm joined today by Chris Fish, who's a Senior Development Management Engineer, and who'll be assisting me on any transport issues.
Okay, thank you. Morning, Mr. Fish, as well. And Mr. Samuel, are you with us now? Not as yet.
No, Mr. Samuel will be joining at 10 o'clock. Thank you, Inspector.
At 10 o'clock, okay. Thank you.
Inspector, could I just say that Mrs. Robinson was also down to attend, and I haven't heard from her yet. I think she'll also be joining later, but we'll have to see when she joins.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. Thank you for that. We'll deal with that when it happens. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to start on heritage assets, which is policy DM13. So if you could turn to that, please, in the plan. So policy DM13, page 137 of the core strategy. So we've got a couple of follow-up questions on that. So the question we asked at the outset is policy DM13 consistent with national policy and effective in respect of its approach to heritage assets? So we note that policy DM13 hasn't attracted objections from Historic England at regulation 19 stage. but there are several areas in which I need to explore the consistency of the policy with policies in the framework, particularly those parts of the framework under considering potential impacts in relation to conserving and enhancing the historic environment. So paragraphs 193 through to 197 in particular. So if I just perhaps start with the councils, and Mr. Farrow, I'm not sure who will deal with this in the first instance, but the question is, does policy DM13 make clear how a decision maker should respond to a proposal which will lead to substantial or less than substantial harm to the significance of a designated heritage asset? So as well as referring to the policy, if you can just observe paragraphs 195 or 196 of the framework. So
I think Mr. Hammond and I are going to deal with the heritage aspects between us. So I'm happy to just start on this one and then hand over to Mr. Hammond if there's something he'd like to add.
thank you.
So in terms of listed buildings, Part D of the policy discusses when the council will approve development that will cause substantial harm to, so total or substantial demolition of a listed building. I think that is intended to equate to the substantial harm identified in the MPPF, and that will only be in exceptional circumstances. In terms of less than substantial harm, parts A to C of DM13 in respect of listed buildings discuss the approach the council will take to harms other than substantial harm. Now, I anticipate that you may have some concerns about the absence of effectively an internal balancing mechanism, as one sees in paragraph 196 of the MPPF, which allows for harm where it's outweighed by public benefits.
Yeah.
I suppose the council's position is that inevitably in every case you will assess benefits and weigh them against the harms, and that's implicit when you look at the plan and read it as a whole. But if you think a more specific reference to the balancing of public benefits would be useful in this policy, that's something the council are willing to consider.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think my take on that is that clearly I read those points in under listed buildings, but clearly the tests in the framework in terms of substantial harm and less than substantial harm apply to all designated heritage assets, so they apply to conservation areas as well. And I couldn't see specific reference to those words and the policy tests in the framework in relation to conservation areas. So I mean, I do wonder if the council needs to just go back and reflect on how the tests in 195 or 196 can be incorporated into the policy so that they apply to all designated heritage assets. I mean, clearly there's no need to repeat everything in the framework. I think the problem with the policy as it stands is I'm not sure that it clearly represents the substantial harm test. So only in exceptional circumstances to grant listed building consent. I mean, 195 implies that there's a much wider range of criteria it's clear there's a much wider range of criteria to consider in assessing substantial harm. So unless it can be demonstrated that the substantial harm or loss is necessary to achieve substantial public benefits. So the words exceptional don't really appear in that test, or exceptional circumstances don't really appear in that test. So I think as it stands, certainly in relation to listed buildings, that criterion D doesn't reflect or is not consistent with paragraph 195 of the framework. And as I say, there is no reference to it in relation to conservation areas. And yes, you're right, paragraph 196 then in relation to less than substantial harm clearly refers to the balancing exercise that needs to be undertaken. So I'm happy to leave that with the council to come back to us on that.
Thank you, sir, we will.
Okay. If I can just turn to the next section of the policy, which is non-designated heritage assets. So the first paragraph under that reads, the council will also protect non-designated heritage assets. The effect of a proposal on the significance of a non-designated heritage asset will be weighed against the public benefits of the proposal, balancing the scale of harm. My question really is, is that consistent with paragraph 197 of the framework in weighing the effect of a proposal on a non-designated heritage asset against public benefits? And the hint is I can't see specific reference to public benefits in 197.
No, there isn't specific reference to public benefits in 197. I suppose we can take that away. I mean, I think otherwise the wording is largely consistent with paragraph 197 of the NPPF, but the reference to public, I think we can go away and think about whether that word should be removed.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay. Next, I wanted to turn to the issue of removal of permitted development rights. So question 2 through 3 in the MIQs was, is policy DM13 justified and effective, particularly in respect of the reference to the removal of PD rights and the inclusion of reference to the use of SPD in informing planning decisions? So specifically in relation to the removal of PD rights. Yeah, I mean, the question is, in the policy, does the intention in the policy to consider withdrawing PD rights within conservation areas, does that refer to the use of Article 4 directions, or does it refer to the use of planning conditions on permissions? That wasn't clear to me.
Sure, my understanding is it's the latter.
It's planning conditions.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, and are you satisfied that that reasonably reflects the approach to the use of planning conditions in the PPG and in the framework? So consider the withdrawal of PD rights where they present a threat to the protection of the character and special interests of the conservation area. I mean, generally, the PPG discourages a sort of blanket approach to withdrawal of PD rights, which possibly this is moving towards.
I think that the intention, and if it's not clear, then that can be looked at, is just to record that it may be appropriate in some cases to withdraw PD rights through a condition on a planning permission where it's appropriate, where it's appropriate to do so for the reasons set out there. So I don't think it's intended to suggest a blanket approach to the removal always of PD rights, but only where those circumstances set out in that final bullet are met.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder whether so the PPG uses words along the lines of where this is justified to preserve the character and appearance of the conservation area. So I wonder whether that may be something the council may consider to be a more appropriate form of words, rather than simply where they present a threat to the protection of character and special interests. So, yeah.
Happy to look at wording that more closely reflects the PPG.
Okay, thank you. That would be helpful. And then lastly, in relation to heritage, the MIQ's question 234 said, is the plan effective and consistent with national policy in respect of the impact of the policies and proposals on heritage assets? So yeah, with regard to that question, whether the plan is consistent overall with national policy. So we've noted the changes that are being proposed or suggested by the council, which have been agreed with Heritage England in relation to various policies, but also site allocations, the IP1 opportunity areas, which we've already discussed. What I wanted just to turn to was policy CS2. So just to clarify that I've understood the proposed changes correctly. So I think this is in the suggested main modifications, it's MM21. Yeah, there were just two changes referred to in the statement of common ground to policy CS2. In terms of what had been agreed with Historic England right at the end of the policy. I just want to, so it's the last paragraph, maximising, in the interest of maximising the use of previously developed land, residential development densities will be high in the town centre and low medium in the rest of IP1, low elsewhere, provided that in all areas it respects and responds positively to heritage assets. And then a final sentence, further details on the council's approach to density set out in policy DM23. So it's just to clarify, it may seem like a straightforward question, but what is in the suggested main modifications for policy CS2, is that the correct version? Yeah.
That's as I understand it. Mr. Hammond is nodding.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay, thank you. So we can move off of heritage unless there are any other points that no other hands raised. Yeah, so we'll move on to design policies now. So looking at policy DM12, first of all. So design and character, just a couple of follow-up questions on this policy. So we asked, are the requirements of policy DM12 for 25% of new dwellings to be built to building regs standard M42 justified? And read the council's response to that. What I couldn't find anywhere was the evidence to justify that figure of 25%. So clearly that has been challenged by, it hasn't been challenged by one or two parties, but what I think what I wanted to understand is when I read through the supporting text to that, yeah, it appears to sort of jump from, if I look at paragraph 9.12.4 of the supporting text, it says the number and middle of the paragraph, the number and proportion of elderly residents in the borough is predicted to increase over future years, potentially further increasing the need for dwellings to be accessible and adaptable. Therefore, 25% of dwellings on sites of 10 or more should be M24 compliant or M42 compliant. So I couldn't see the evidence that supports a figure of 25% and wondered if the council could point me to that.
So if I may, effectively the 25% arises from the census, 2011 census, which indicated that about 17% of the council's population required accessible housing. And also since that time, we've also had the strategic housing market assessment. I forget if it's part 1 or part 2 off the top of my head, but I'm sure I can tell you soon. But that also it stated that 24.5% of households in the Ipswich housing market area were older person only households, and that's higher than regional and national averages, which hover around 20%. And according to the strategic housing market assessment, again, by 2036, it's predicted to rise that number. So given the evidence we have, we think 25% as a starting point is justified. Thank you.
Yeah, so the 24.5 is at the start of the plan period.
It's slightly before, because the strategic housing market area assessment goes to 2014, I believe, to 2036.
Okay.
So it will be slightly before the plan period, but yeah.
Okay, all right. Okay, thank you. Yeah, there's a suggested change to policy DM12 in relation to green roofs. Yeah, MM53 in the suggested main modifications. Yeah. So it's an addition to criterion D to introduce greener streets and spaces to contribute to local biodiversity, net gain, visual amenity and health and well-being, and offset the impacts of climate change. This could include green roofs, walls, other measures to ensure the urban environment becomes greener and healthier. So it's just a simple question whether that suggested change to include green roofs and other measures for urban greening, whether that is necessary to ensure the policy is effective in offsetting the impacts of climate change.
The short answer is yes, effectively. It's adding additional detail for someone coming in for development, sort of indicating, look, this can help achieve those that objective effectively. So yes, we do think it's effective. Yeah.
Okay. Good morning, Mrs. Robinson. I'm glad you could join us. You have your hand up, and apologies, I didn't notice it until just now. Do you want to speak on this point? Yeah, I can't pick up your voice. I know you're not muted, but there we are. I can hear you now. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a slight aside, but it's just really a question. This isn't an area that I'm totally familiar with, and I haven't done my homework, but in the light of Grenville, and in the light of the current constructions in Ipswich, which appear to be consistent with national policy, but have now been found wanting cladding and materials of this nature and difficulty, I wondered if there's any caution written in the policy to cover that for the future.
Is that in relation to tall buildings? Sorry, you're muted.
Not necessarily tall buildings, cladding per se, and there are standards building regs which are found with the Grenfell issue to be inadequate on a national level. It's not the I do apologise, it's my system that keeps switching me off.
Okay, I can hear you now though.
Thank you. It's in relation to government standards and government policies. The borough can only do as much as it does now, but if the policy is failing, it might be helpful for the borough to have some sort of cautionary phrase in the light of these emerging facts and difficulties in relation to sustainable construction, low carbon and safety, which includes tall buildings and other buildings.
Yeah. Did you have a particular suggestion in relation to design and character? I noticed that, I mean, maybe that's something we can come on to when we talk about sustainable construction. I did note that policy DM15 on tall buildings includes criterion C. It is a requirement that tall buildings are sustainable in design and construction and ensures public safety, including fire safety, of all building users. So I noticed that that was in there in relation to tall buildings. Mr. Furr, could you assist on this? In relation to policy DM12, or perhaps more generally in the plan, is this something that the plan picks up or should pick up?
It's certainly something we can consider. Generally speaking, one would imagine that it was in respect of tall buildings, particularly that this issue arose, and it is, as you say, covered in the relevant policy there. But if you think a specific reference to fire safety would be useful, then I'm sure that's something we can consider.
Yeah, I mean, it is covered by the building regulations. Maybe I could just sort of bat it back to the council to just take a look at it and see if something needs to be covered in perhaps in the sustainable construction policy, so that it's relevant to all buildings, not just tall buildings.
Yes, that's I'm sure something we can consider.
Okay. Thank you, Mrs. Robinson, for raising that. Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry. It may be the council comes back and says, no, we're satisfied. This is covered by other regulatory regimes, but exactly. But
we will come back to you one way or the other.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to move on to policy DM15, tall buildings, that we were just talking about. So we asked a question, is policy DM15 justified and effective in respect of the siting and design of tall buildings? And is the proposed change to criterion I, set out in the Statement of Common Ground with Historic England, sufficient to ensure that the settings of conservation areas and scheduled monuments are safeguarded? I've picked up from Appendix 11 to the Statement of Common Ground with Historic England. There is a revised tall buildings arc map that I have, which shows some modifications to the boundaries of the tall buildings arc. Principally, as I understand, pulling it away from the Willis building, and also the churchyards of St. Peter's, St. Mary's at the Quay and St. Nicholas, and as well as the change to criterion I to include reference to the settings of conservation areas and scheduled monuments. So I think that's MM56 in the, MM56 in the suggested modifications. What I just wanted to clarify, and it may seem like a picky point, but the suggested change to criterion I references, preserves the strategic and local views with particular reference to the settings of conservation areas, listed buildings, scheduled monuments and other heritage assets. So previously it simply said with particular reference to conservation areas, listed buildings. My question just was whether the intention of that change was purely to refer it to the settings of conservation areas, listed buildings and scheduled monuments, or whether in fact it now has the effect of excluding effects of views within the conservation area.
I see the point, sir. I think it probably should say, with reference to conservation areas, listed buildings, and other heritage assets and their settings.
Yes, yeah, I think so, yeah, because certainly from my understanding of the policies map, at least part of the eastern end of the tall buildings sits within, I think, the town centre conservation area. So it did seem to me that there may well be views within that conservation area that could be affected, not just the setting of it. Okay, just something to take away, and yeah, you could perhaps just come back with a revised wording on that. Thank you. So that was all on tall buildings. Thank you. If we could turn to policy 18, DM18 now. Mr. Samuel, good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us. So we've covered heritage and design and tall buildings. We're just moving on to amenity. Policy DM18. So we asked the question, should policy DM18 refer to technical guidance on overlooking in order to be effective? The council's response is no, you expect development to be designed to protect privacy and to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. That overlooking is dealt with on a case-by-case basis. So I understand that. I think what I just wanted to ask is, if I put myself in the position of a decision maker in relation to a scheme, I think the question is, how can a decision maker judge whether a development proposal, so this is particularly in relation to overlooking, whether a development proposal might result in overlooking or loss of privacy without reference to guidelines on separation distances between facing habitable room windows. So without any reference to a sort of, I guess, a minimum separation distance, how can one judge whether a proposal would result in overlooking or loss of privacy?
Yes, so we had another look at this, and perhaps it might be appropriate. There's the Council Space and Design Guidelines, SPD, which in the core doc library is referenced G5. And within that does contain information such as, it should be 21 meters distance, and it does provide some guidelines in there.
Yeah.
So perhaps something we could go away as look at is maybe include reference to that SPD in the policy or in the reason justification, if it would help to provide some clarity.
Yeah, or even in the policy.
Yeah.
I mean, it does seem to me a set minimum separation distance is a policy matter. So certainly how that's applied and how it's interpreted in relation to different urban relationships would seem to me to be a suitable matter for SPD, but the actual minimum separation distance itself ought to appear in the policy.
Just to clarify, sir, so you would want us perhaps to consider looking at an actual distance within the policy itself. So it might say, for example, 21 meters, if that's what the sort of guideline SPD suggests, or is it the reference to the SPD that might be more appropriate?
No, I think it's the separation distance itself. I mean, it doesn't need to refer to the other guidance in there, but it doesn't need to incorporate the other guidance in there. It can certainly refer to the guidance in the SPD in terms of taking account of that. But I think if there's a set minimum separation distance in the SPD, that ought to find its way into the policy as it is a policy matter. Yeah. Sorry for being so directive on that, but I think that's that's the approach that I think would be most appropriate. Okay, thank you. Okay. If we could turn now to policy DM17, which is infill and backland residential developments. So we asked the question in the MIQs, should policy DM17 include reference to the unacceptable loss of semi-natural habitat? So we've had original representations from the Suffolk Wildlife Trust on that matter, and had the council's response on that, which I understand, and also a response from SOX and NFPG, if I can use those abbreviations, in relation to that, arguing that there should be a reference to unacceptable loss of semi-natural habitat in the policy. So I think I wanted to perhaps to come to Mr. Samuel or Mrs. Robinson on this and just ask why you consider it's necessary for soundness in policy DM17 to include reference to protecting the loss of semi-natural habitat when policy DM8 provides protection for habitat supporting protected or priority species, and that it's already covered in policy DM8. Why does it need to be covered separately or in addition in this policy? I don't know who wants to come, or maybe both Mr. Samuel and Mrs. Robinson. Mr. Samuel, yeah.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. Perhaps just a cross-reference might help.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. And yes, Mrs. Robinson, yeah. I'm not.
I do apologise. My screen defaults to switching off everything, and I have to go through a whole loop. I do apologise.
Okay.
I think it would be best left there, belt and braces, particularly as the habitat areas in Ipswich are diminishing with the policy.
I
can't hear you.
Okay, I can hear you now.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
It's sort of frozen. My system. I can now. Thank you. Sorry. I think just a reference across. I would rather have it spelled out, and Suffolk Wildlife Trust are the experts, and if they've recommended it, I would go with that.
Okay. Thank you, Mrs. Robinson. And just come back to the council on that and just ask, I mean, it does seem to me when I look at policy DM17 that it, I mean, it includes criteria which are reflected in other policies in the plan. So, for example, it refers to amenity, which is covered separately in policy DM18. It refers to garden sizes, which is covered in policy DM7. It refers to access, acceptable, safe and convenient access, which is covered in policy DM21. It refers to parking standards, which is separately covered in DM22. So I just wondered if it's not entirely consistent that it doesn't include a criterion referring separately to safeguarding semi-natural habitats. I don't know who wants to deal with that from the council.
I can deal. I think so. The other aspect of this specific request for semi-natural habitats to be included is it's difficult to define that, and also this is going to apply to generally potentially back gardens, which we don't have a record of in terms of where the semi-natural habitats are in each person's garden, as you'd expect. So it's quite difficult to define that. In relation to the other point, I take your point that it does, you know, for example, DM7 is explicitly referenced there, but I still think DM8 would apply to all developments that this would fall under. So I'm not sure necessarily, it seems necessary. But that, yeah, so I think.
Would a cross-reference to DM8 and including it as a criteria assist?
it might be something we can go away and consider, perhaps, if you think it's appropriate.
It's clearly a relevant consideration where you're dealing with a large
Absolutely, yeah.
large plot, which may have a substantial amount of wooded coverage. Yeah. Okay. All right. So you'll take that away and just have a look at the potential for a cross reference to policy DM8. Thank you. On our agenda, my apologies. There is another question we asked in the MIQs on DM17, which is an important one, I think, to come back to. Does policy DM17 unduly constrain the ability of the borough to secure the sufficient windfall housing to ensure the delivery of the projected housing land supply? So I understand the council's response to that. I just wanted to come back to the council on this point, really, and just ask a further question in relation to this policy. So, I mean, as drafted, it's a negatively worded policy. So proposals for infill and backland development, severance of plots will not be permitted unless. And question back to the council is whether the plan would be more positively prepared and its reliance on windfall housing to meet the housing requirements would be justified and more effective if DM17 gave positive support to small-scale infill and backland residential developments, except where it caused unacceptable harm to the range of matters covered in the criteria. Don't know who wants to come back to me on that from the council, but it seemed to me there's quite an important point about the extent to which the council encourages this type of windfall.
Yes, yeah. I take your point. I mean, we've demonstrated in the previous sessions regarding our housing land supply, and whilst windfall forms part of that, it's not the, we're not overly reliant on it to that extent. And I think given the urban nature of the borough and the fact that, garden sizes, are limited, it's a compact urban, I just don't think it's necessarily something that we want to be seen to. I think it's more of an exception to the rule rather than something we want to, encourage. I think this policy does work really well. We've had lots of appeals recently where it's held up and being successful, where schemes have been inappropriate. And speaking with development management colleagues, it is really effective. As it was originally written, it's changed slightly. I think there's a new criteria in there, criteria G, but other than that, it does the same thing. So I think we'd like to keep it as it is worded, if possible. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think key words there is it's effective in resisting proposals, isn't it? And I think, the plan does rely on its windfall provision to meet the 5-year land supply, 50 units a year. And yes, the evidence does suggest that that's achievable. Of course, the more sites that are allocated, the tighter that potential windfall capacity gets. And it may well have been effective in the past. But the question is whether the council needs to take a more positive approach to smaller windfall sites like this coming forward.
So I think just to add on that, sir, I think an equivalent policy has been and is currently in place and hasn't, in the council's view, unduly restricted windfall development. But obviously there's a balance to be struck between not stifling windfall development, but at the same time protecting amenity and garden space, existing garden space, which is in some cases in short supply in Ipswich. And I think the council's view is that this policy strikes the right balance. It has struck the right balance in the past, and they want to take it forward.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Samuel.
I was just going to reiterate the the comments about being balanced and effective. The NFPG has sort of looked at a number of the infill applications, some of which we've deemed to be appropriate, some of which we think haven't, for various reasons. Those reasons have been considered. Some of the applications have been resubmitted, taking account of concerns, and then been approved. I think at the moment, from our experience, that policy has been shown to be effective and has also delivered windfall sites within the area that we are familiar with.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Stone. That's helpful. Okay. Although policy DM24 is listed for further discussion, I'm satisfied that I have no further questions on policy DM24. That's protection and provision of community facilities. That is subject to, I think the change is suggested in MM61 that relates to removing the reference to demonstrating to the council's satisfaction in a couple of the criteria. So that is suggested as a modification by the council, and yeah, it seems to me those changes should ensure the policy is effective. So other than that, no further questions on that, unless there are any comments any of the parties wish to make. Okay. Okay, so we'll turn now to policy DM1, which is sustainable construction. Just bear with me whilst I get there in the plan. So we asked in the main issues and questions, is policy DM1 effective and consistent with national policy with regard to sustainable construction? So in terms of, I've had responses to that, thank you. In terms of the criteria, if I can just take criterion A, I think satisfied, no further questions on criterion B. So I've seen the evidence to support the optional technical standard in respect of water efficiency. So I can see that, no further questions to ask on that. But in relation to criterion A, these are really a couple of questions of clarification. So with regard to CO2 emissions, so this requires 19% below the target emission rate in the 2013 edition of the 2010 building regulations. And as I understand it, level 4 or 19% lower than or less than the target emission rate is equivalent to level 4 of the Code for Sustainable Homes, as I understand it. So I understand where the figure has come from. I think my concern perhaps was just with the wording of the criteria referring to below the target emission rate. So yeah, it strikes me that what the policy is looking at is a 19% improvement on that rate, isn't it? And my question really to the council is whether that emissions target should be expressed as a 19% improvement in emission rates over the requirements of the building regulations. Small point, but
yes,
yeah.
I think that sounds reasonable. Having looked at other schemes, they often refer to it as an improvement as well. So yeah, perhaps if it's a slight word change, I think that's something we could look into.
Okay. Thank you. No other questions on policy DM1. Turn to policy DM2, which is decentralised, renewable or low carbon energy. We asked a question in the MIQs, is the target for all new build of 10 or more dwellings or in excess of 1,000 square metres of residential or non-residential floor spaces of at least 15% of energy requirements from decentralised and renewable low carbon sources in the policy? Is that target justified and effective? So I just a point of clarification for the council is where the evidence to demonstrate that 15% target, where is the evidence to demonstrate that's equivalent to Code for Sustainable Homes Level 4? I think that's what the council said in its response, that it is equivalent, but I couldn't see the evidence to support that. Don't know whether anyone could assist me on that, please.
Thank you, sir. Sorry, I don't have the say the code right in front of me right now, so perhaps that is something we could look into. But more generally speaking, this 15% requirement, again, there's an adopted equivalent policy before in the 2017 plan, which also had the 15%. And again, it's been delivered on employment and residential schemes in the borough. But as I understand, I think the 15% also aligns with the UK's National Renewable Energy Action Plan, which required the UK to get 15% of its emissions from renewable sources by 2020. Obviously, we're in 2020 now, but as I understand that there wasn't a further percent to go off, for the future as such. But so I think, as I understand, that's where it may have come from.
Okay. Perhaps you could just give me the references to those. That would help. But obviously, the adopted policy, I can see that and go back and look at that. But yeah, if you can just give me the references to the source for that, happy to receive that outside of the hearing session. Okay. Yeah, I then just had a question on the 10 or more dwellings. So I'm not sure whether, because the March 2015 written ministerial statement, so it states that small housing sites of 10 units or fewer will be exempted from off-site carbon abatement measures. So my question is the 10 or more dwellings intended to exempt small house builders from this, or does it refer to major development? I guess if it's the former, then it should be more than 10 units rather than 10 or more.
Yes, I would say that it's intended, obviously, it's not just aimed at dwellings, it's aimed at obviously non-residential. So it is linked to major development. I take on board the point about the ministerial statement. It's not our intention to apply it to small scale house builders, but perhaps we could look into the wording. But all I would, it's worded exactly the same as the adopted policy. So
yeah,
it's
and the ministerial statement was in place at the time. Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're saying essentially that 10 or more refers to major development, not specifically
Yes.
the exemption for small builders. Yeah. Okay. That's fine. Any other points on DM2 before I move on to policy DM21, transport and access? Okay, we're making good time. So we just turn to policy DM21. Yeah, and there are some suggested changes to policy DM21 as well in the main modifications. So I think it's MM 57 and 58 regarding travel plans. So we asked a question, is DM21 effective, justified and consistent with national policy in respect of transport and access in new developments? Council's proposing some changes to the policy and the supporting text to update travel plan references and thresholds to align with the thresholds in the county council's guidance, or the county-wide guidance, the Suffolk travel plan guidance, I think. So my question really is that in relation to those suggested changes, should the indicative thresholds for the types of development for which travel plans are required, as set out in the Suffolk travel plan guidance, should they in fact be included in the policy to ensure compliance with the PPG in respect of the role of SPDs? Yeah, Mr. Clow.
The county council wouldn't have an objection to putting thresholds specifically within policy. I would like to say that we would like to make sure there is some flexibility with those thresholds. So I think, you know, we've stated in the modifications that there may be some cases where a development doesn't quite meet the threshold, but you still may want a travel plan. For example, if it's close to an AQMA, so air quality is a particular issue. We would be happy to look at putting in thresholds into policy. It may also have some kind of knock-on effect to putting thresholds for transport assessments and statements in policy, because those then inform the travel plans. But I'm happy to have discussions about that with the Borough Council.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to say, I think the same applies in respect of perhaps in respect of the requirements for electric vehicle charging capacity. So including the proportion of rapid charging points, which are specified outside of the plan in the Suffolk guidance for parking and low emissions SPD. And I guess the question is, should that be referred to in the policy, or should the specific requirements be referred to in the policy, including the proportion of rapid charging points rather than outside?
I mean, what I would possibly say to that is that the sort of charging point issue is a sort of changing issue. So obviously the government have brought forward their deadlines as to when they want more cars to be electric, and having in guidance does help us with flexibility in terms of kind of advancing that, whereas if it's baked into policy, it's harder to be flexible on that, is all I would say. Yeah.
I mean, what an alternative way of dealing with it, I'm happy for the council and the county council just to sort of take the policy away and come back to us, but another way of dealing with it is perhaps how it's dealt with in the Suffolk Coastal Local Plan, where the wording is around I do have a copy of it here, just bear with me. Yeah, so it's the precise wording I can't lay my eyes on at the moment, but it's around the policy and the supporting text talking about taking account of the guidance rather than requiring things to be in accordance with the guidance. Yeah, so that may be an alternative way to deal with it, to ensure it's compliant with national policy in respect of the role of SPDs. I think the important point is that the SPD shouldn't contain matters of policy. Clearly, the role of the SPD is to guide how policy should be applied. But if there are particular standards and thresholds, and we'll perhaps come on to this in relation to car parking standards as well, if there are particular standards and thresholds, then it's only appropriate that those should be included in policy. But we can come on to that in relation to car parking. But yeah, okay. So I'm happy that you take away policy DM21 to look at how it references the guidance in relation to travel plans and parking and low emissions SPD. Yeah. Thank you. So I had one further question in relation to this policy, which relates to air quality limit values. So we can come on to this, and possibly Mr. Samuel may wish to contribute on this as well. Paragraph 181 of the framework states that planning policies and decisions should contribute towards compliance with limit values in relation to air quality. And both SOTS and AFPG seek changes to the policy to that effect. Yeah. And my question to the council is whether perhaps criterion B of the policy, which says development should or shall not result in a significant detrimental impact on air quality or an air quality management area, and address the appropriate mitigation measures as required through policy DM3. So my question is whether, in fact, it perhaps should go further and should make reference to the way in which a planning decision should contribute towards compliance with air quality limit values. I don't know who wants to deal with that from the council.
Yeah, I can have a go. So yes, I think having looked at it, whilst we don't necessarily agree with the suggested amendment from the Northern Fringe Protection Group and Save Our Country Spaces, it could perhaps the criteria be simplified in the sense that because I think the way it's worded with the AQMAs, I think what we want to achieve is effectively that it doesn't. Sorry, I'm just getting the wording in front of me. So currently it says, yes, not result in a significant detrimental impact on air quality or an air quality management area. But I think we just wanted to say not result in a significant detrimental impact on air quality sort of generally, because the air quality management area is a bit redundant at that point, if that makes sense. But in terms of the reference to the, as suggested by the Save Our Country Space, the non-compliance with the UK air quality targets, we don't think that would be appropriate. The paragraph 181 of the NPPF says you should contribute towards compliance, but if you've got a development and the levels are already non-compliant in that area, are you going to say that no development shall take place in that air quality management area, if that makes sense? So I think that might be a step too far, and we think it's the key thing is that the policy DM21, which links to DM3, contributes towards addressing air quality by aligning with the actions of the Air Quality Action Plan, and the Air Quality Action Plan sets out actions to improve air quality and sort of monitor that outside of planning as well. So we're open to amending it to remove that an air quality management area aspect potentially, but I don't think we'd want to say towards non-compliance with UK targets.
Yeah, or towards compliance with limit values.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I appreciate the wording requested by SOTS and FPG was that development should not contribute to non-compliance, whereas paragraph 181 talks about policies contributing towards compliance. So I think it's really provided some clarity on how proposals should be considered in relation to that particular part of national policy. So how does one determine a proposal in relation to whether it contributes towards compliance with the relevant limit values?
I think sorry, if I could just chip in, I think in terms of planning, so paragraph 181, planning policies should contribute towards compliance with limit values. So it's the policy requirements and the kind of need for a developer to overcome those. It's those things that are intended through para 181 to contribute towards compliance. And the way that's achieved is in part through DM21 and DM3 by preventing exceedances of the type discussed in policy DM3, paragraphs A to C. So development proposals shouldn't create any new areas that exceed air quality limits or delay the date at which compliance is achieved, should not reduce air quality benefits that result from the Borough Council's activities, should not create unacceptable risks of exposure. So these are ways in which the policies are contributing towards compliance with limit values by preventing delays or exacerbations to exceedances.
Okay. Yeah, Mr. Samuel, please come in at that point. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. I think simply removing the reference to air quality management areas doesn't actually help at all with regard to our concerns. It goes no further. With reference to the comments on delaying the date at which compliance will be achieved, page 111. I'm not sure what that actually means, because what is the date at which Ipswich Borough Council plan to achieve compliance? The problem we have is that in Ipswich Borough, it's very difficult for Ipswich Borough Council. They're not other highways authorities. It's a hard issue to tackle. However, that shouldn't be an excuse not to actually do things. And what we found that within Ipswich, we haven't seen the level of improvement in air quality over the last two plan periods, over the last decade, that we would have liked to have seen. What we have seen is an increase in the number of AQMAs. So we're not seeing sort of new infrastructure being delivered to tackle the existing problem, as well as the softer measures, never mind addressing the new development. So at what point will Ipswich Borough Council look to achieve compliance? And how can they do that if there are if new developments are going to be allowed to have a detrimental impact on existing quality? And I note the word significant. So what does significant mean? Is it more or less than major? Is it more or less than some? We're not getting anywhere here on this, and this links into the modal shift and the infrastructure issues that we have our major concerns on. If you looked at one particular area, the AQMAs 1 and 2, Chevalier Street, Norwich Road, that goes right past I think it's an early learning centre, and you have a primary school at the bottom. So young children are walking through there. It's a difficult area to tackle. I know that. We have sympathy for Ipswich Borough Council, but that it needs to be addressed, and we're not seeing any movement here.
Okay. Thank you. Mrs. Robinson.
Hello, I hope you can hear me.
I can, yes.
Thank you. I would like to agree with everything Mr. Samuel said, and I also think that the moving on with the climate change agenda and the emergency measures taken by both the Borough and Suffolk County Council will continue to inform this. Our problem is that aligning with the Equality Action Plan isn't sufficient, because we have issues with the Air Quality Action Plan. We were hoping we would be party to that working group, and we were told we could be, and then we never invited. So we still have issues with that action plan. And our biggest issue is that the action plan and all the work that's been done is based on an evaluation of 20 years ago. Well, things have moved on. No harms from particulates are legally required to be measured by the borough, as I've already explained before. So I think the whole action plan needs revisiting in the light of the new local plan as well, plus factoring in the work done by the county council. And I also would like to say I have every sympathy with the borough, who are in a really difficult place with this. They've done their very, very best in extremely difficult circumstances. But if they're not supported, and both financially and in other ways by other parties like the county council and others, then it's very difficult for them to make improvements in this area. And we're not entirely blaming the borough or their plan. We're saying it is what it is. It's an inadequate and a difficult area. We hope that the inspectors will appreciate the dilemma that faces Ipswich in respect of this, and sort of review your comments and your feedback accordingly.
In the light of that, thank you, Mrs. Robinson. Well, I think we do understand. Ah, sorry, you've gone on to mute, Mrs. Robinson. Mrs. Robinson.
I had finished.
That's okay. I missed the last 30 seconds of what you said. You went on to mute.
Oh, okay. I was just explaining that the borough are caught between a rock and a hard place on this issue. And are you not hearing me?
No, I can hear you. Yeah.
Sorry. And they definitely need the support of other partners to support them in their aspiration.
Thank you. Thank you. Mrs. Robinson, what I was going to say was appreciate your contribution. I think we do understand that dilemma and the difficulties that, and I've seen your hand, Mr. Clow, thank you, the difficulties that the Borough Council have, and your contributions help us to gain a better understanding of that. So I'll ask Mr. Clow to perhaps come back on that, and if I could ask the Borough Council at the end of that just to come back on point raised by Mr. Samuel about, is there a date by which the council aims to achieve limit values? Yeah, Mr. Clow.
I just wanted to add in that the county council does want to support the borough council in meeting its sort of air quality aims, and we're aiming to do that as a highway authority and as a public health authority. That's part of what the mode shift strategy is about. And as you've heard throughout this examination, we are currently implementing measures using government funding, and we're progressing on the mode shift strategy. So that's I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thank you. Does the council want to come back? Yeah, thank you, Ms. Tapour. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Just a couple of points. In response first to the issue about what a significant detrimental impact on air quality is, and whether policy DM21 should go further and exclude any detrimental impact on air quality. First, as to what is significant, we consider that those factors set out in DM3 A to C indicate what a significant air quality impact would be. Mm-hmm. Second point, we don't think it's appropriate for the plan to go further and to preclude any detrimental impact on air quality, because any development, as you can imagine, sir, the construction and operation of which is likely to have some air quality impacts. But if background levels are well below limit values, then that in the council view should not be precluded. That would stifle all development. Mm. As to the date by which compliance is to be achieved, I understand that those compliance dates are set at a national level in the national air quality objectives, and I appreciate the Northern Fringe Protection Group and Save Our Country Spaces are very concerned about the legally binding nature of air quality limit values. Those legal obligations to comply with those values rest on the Secretary of State. It's his legal obligation to ensure compliance, and the way that that is done is through the production of an air quality plan, which may in turn require local authorities to produce their own air quality action plans and designate air quality management areas, which is what Ipswich Borough Council has done. It has an air quality action plan already in place, and it reports on the relevant pollutants every year in and I think it's I can't remember the name of the document actually off the top of my head. It may be that Mr. Hammond can remind me, but there's a report every year that goes to DEFRA, and compliance or otherwise is then considered at a national level. And that's the way that the role of the local plan is to set appropriate policies to try and avoid non-compliance. And that's what this plan does. And it doesn't need to go any further than it already does in our view.
Yeah. Mr. Clow, was that a, yeah, thank you. Mr. Samuel, do you want to come in again?
Thank you. Yeah, can I just clarify that our concern about increases, increasing impact on the air quality is specifically in those AQMAs or the areas that are reaching the limit values. So it's about, our concerns are about exceeding the limit values. The limit values are set there for a purpose. And therefore, you know, in order to ensure that there isn't any further non-compliance, you need to have something in place that relates to the limit values. The local plan, the purpose of that is to, in relation to limit values, is to ensure that there isn't further exceedances or an increase in exceedances. In relation to the air quality action plans, DEFRA's guidelines for the air quality action plans are clear in that they require time-bounded actions to reduce air pollution with AQMAs. That's what we're asking for.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Obviously, it's not within our remit to make recommendations about other documents, other policy documents, such as the air quality action plans. That's clearly a matter for the council. Okay, so I think just to conclude on criterion B, so I think the council was suggesting it would look again at that criterion to simplify it and refer back to policy DM3, which seems to me to be an appropriate way forward. Okay, thank you. Okay, I think now possibly would be an appropriate time to take a break, because the next matter to move on to is car and cycle parking. So it's probably more than a 5-minute discussion. So I'd rather do policies DM22, and we need to go back to touch on SP17. I'd rather do those together, and then we do come back to air quality on policy DM3. But I think we're making good time, so I'm hopeful that we'll complete everything in good time, hopefully by lunchtime, but we'll have to see how we go. So if everyone's happy, we will adjourn at this point. We'll come back at 11:30, because that's a time that people have already logged as an appropriate time for the resumption. So unless there are any other points on DM21, Thank you. We'll adjourn now. So just turn your cameras off and mute your microphones, but stay in the session. Thank you. Annette, do we do we have Mrs. Robinson back with us?
I don't know is the short answer.
Okay, all right.
She's still in the meeting, and I'm hoping that she can hear and come in as appropriate.
Great, thank you, thank you. I think we'll resume at that point. Mrs. Robinson, welcome. Good to see you. Yeah, firstly, just my apologies for losing track of the policy in the Suffolk Coastal Local Plan just before the break in relation to transport and access. So the bit I wanted to refer the council to, so I think the council is taking the policy away, just have a look at the references to the thresholds for travel plans. So perhaps I can just direct the council to its policy SCLP 7.1, Sustainable Transport in the Suffolk Coastal Local Plan. I refer to this only because it's recently been through examination, and I'm aware this was a point that was considered. But that does contain some thresholds for travel plans. So it's just a useful reference point. I'm not saying that's necessarily the approach to follow, but it's a useful reference point. So that's what I was trying to find. So apologies, I lost that. Okay, so we're looking at policy DM22, car and cycle parking in new development. Okay, so policy DM22 and paragraph, sorry, to kick off with the question we asked in the MIQs was, does policy DM22 defer important policy matters relating to vehicle parking, including cycle parking in new developments, to other policy documents, including the Suffolk guidance for parking, and having regard to regulations 5 and 6 of the Town Country Planning Regulations 2012, should these matters be included in the plan. So appreciate the responses I've had back on that. I think council has said that there is no statutory requirement that such matters should be included within the plan. So just taking us through, so policy DM22 together with the supporting text, paragraph 922.1. So together those two require development to comply with the adopted standards for car and cycle parking contained in the Suffolk guidance for parking, which is an SPD. So as I read it, it therefore does devolve a policy matter affecting the development and use of land and guiding the determination of planning applications to a document which isn't part of the development plan and isn't therefore subject to independent examination. So again, I know what the council said, there's no statutory requirement, but the regulations, particularly regulation 5 and also the PPG, expect such policy requirements to be contained within a DPD rather than an SPD. So if I can just come back to the council and just ask on what basis the council considers that parking requirements are not a policy matter.
So if I could start on that, if I may. Firstly, the rationale for the approach is to enshrine some flexibility in the event that parking standards change over the course of the plan. That's the rationale. Secondly, with reference to regulations 5 and 6 of the 2012 regulations, I think the distinction, as I understand it, is not really between policy and guidance. It's actually to do with the content of whatever you call it. So SPDs can contain policy or statements, but they can't trespass into matters of substance that should go in the development plan document. And what we say is that, looking at regulation 5, one of the things that has to be included in a development plan, a local plan document, are development management and site allocation policies, which are intended to guide the determination of applications, which I think is the point you're referring to. And we say that the reference to in policy DM22, which requires compliance with certain standards, that's the appropriate development management policy. So it's saying if you come forward with a scheme you have to, a requirement in order to find support in this policy is to comply with appropriate standards. And so that already fulfills the requirement in Regulation 5. And then the things that can be included in SPDs then are statements or policy which relate to environmental, social, design, or economic objectives. So objectives basically that are relevant to the attainment of the development and use of land. And so we say that those further statements of guidance that are set out in the parking standards SPD fulfill that SPD role, but you still have the development management policy which says you must comply with appropriate standards.
Yeah, no, well, I understand that, but it does seem to me that requiring a development to comply with standards which themselves are not subject to, which are fairly rigid standards, which are themselves are not subject to examination, does seem to be exempting effectively policy requirements from the examination process. I mean, I wonder if again, it might just help. You may think I love the Suffolk Coastal Local Plan. It's only it's recently been through examination, but I wonder whether it may help by again referring to the relevant policy in the Suffolk Coastal Local Plan, which does seem to me to deal with this in a different way. And again, this was a matter that was examined there as well. So it seems to me there are a couple of alternatives on this. Either the parking standards be included within an appendix, which may not support the flexible approach that the council is looking for, or the policy amended so that proposals are required to have regard to the parking standards rather than required to comply with. A subtle difference, but that may be a way of dealing with it. I think that's the way it's been done in the Suffolk Coastal Local Plan, which has been found sound, of course. So.
Certainly happy to look at that, and I think yes, that latter approach will be more consistent with the desire for flexibility in the event that the standards change. Okay,
Mr. Clough, yes. Sorry, should have asked you to come in before.
No, that's fine. I was actually just going to say the point that Mrs. Tafur mentioned, that if the options are to have regard or to have the full standards in the plan, we would rather have regard because that enables us flexibility, and that flexibility to update the parking standards based on new evidence. Because I should stress that the parking standards are evidence based, and they are intended to contribute towards sort of the goals of the councils. So
yeah, no, I understand that. I mean, of course, the plan takes different approaches with different things, doesn't it? So there are some standards that are included as appendices in the plan. So certainly, open space standards are included as an appendix to the plan. Yeah, so I guess it depends on the approach you want to take, but ideally, I think they should be the subject of examination and included within the plan. But if the council requires some flexibility over time on that, then I think the only way to deal with it is by the wording change that we've talked about. Yeah. Okay. Okay, thank you. I wanted to come on to, I appreciate that we have already looked at SP17 in relation to the IP1 area, but I did have some specific questions on that in relation to the overall parking strategy for the central area. So we asked a couple of questions on SP17, which were, is the town centre parking strategy in SP17 justified and effective? Has consideration been given to its impact on climate change and air quality? And then secondly, does SP17 provide a clear indication of how decision makers should react to a development proposal for car parking on the allocated sites? So just really a couple of follow-ups on that. So I noticed the there are some changes suggested in the modifications, MM 101 to 104, I think. Yeah. So, and those are changes that have been agreed with the County Council in relation to making sure the Old Cattle Market site is included as one of the sites for long stay parking. Yeah, and some clarity over no net gain in long stay parking spaces, and so linking the provision of new spaces to the expiry of temporary permissions. So I understand those changes. I just had some questions for the council before inviting other parties to respond. Appreciate that possibly Mr. Samuel, Mrs. Robinson may wish to comment on this, as you have done in your representations. So firstly, just coming to the council, possibly the county council may wish to contribute on this as well. But as I read it, the policy seeks no net increase in the number of parking spaces in and around the town centre. So basically seeking to maintain parking provision at current levels. I think that's my understanding. And the question really is how is that consistent with a transport strategy which seeks to reduce the number of commuters, visitors, shoppers travelling into the town by car, and to achieve a 15% shift to more sustainable modes of transport. So I just wanted to understand how that parking strategy fitted with that overall transport strategy. Yeah.
Do you want me to go for that? I think Mr. Clow might come in after me, but broadly speaking, I mean, the strategy is more of us looking at it from a spatial point of view in terms of where the parking should go to minimise the need to travel across the town centre, for example. So aiming to reduce congestion and yes, target in that sense. But also, I think part of this parking strategy is it require, for example, electric vehicle charging points to be installed in these specific car parks, which obviously, if you have a level car park at the moment, that doesn't currently have. And for example, things like cycle parking needs to be installed there to try and contribute towards those modal shift goals. But it is aimed, I think we need to factor in that over time, naturally, there's going to be traffic. This is more about trying to manage where that's going. It has to accept that there's going to be traffic coming into Ipswich. It's about trying to manage that with the transport mitigation strategy that the council, county council have prepared with the ISPA authorities. I don't know if Mr. Clow wants to expand on anything more than that, but
I just wanted to add that I agree completely with Mr. Hammond's comments, that this is around the spatial element of the parking strategy, but the other element of parking strategy is the management of parking as well, which we've had discussions about with the Borough Council. The strategy, the parking strategy is part of the core documents, but this is focusing on the spatial elements, whereas there's also a parking management element that needs to be considered as well in achieving those mode shift targets.
Yeah. So I guess my question was about quantum, really. So the aim to maintain the current level of parking in the town centre, is that justified alongside a reduction in the volume of traffic coming into the town centre or into the town?
So could it, I don't know, Mr. Hammond or Mr. Clow want to comment on this, but in light of the housing growth that's going to be seen in Ipswich, the maintenance rather than increase of car parking provision in the town centre would seem to be consistent with a move towards more sustainable travel, because it's not that the council are intending to increase car parking standards to account for the increase in housing that will be delivered over the plan period.
Is there anything you want to comment on there, Mr. Hammond, Mr. Clow?
Not from me, no.
Okay.
No additional comments from me.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, my next question then is really whether, looking forwards, and I appreciate in the current COVID-19 world that's difficult, but I'm just seeking clarification as to whether the parking strategy, seeking to maintain a level of spaces, accepting that in future there will be housing growth in Ipswich, but whether that parking strategy also offers the flexibility to respond to the potential future reduction in demand for town centre office and retail floor space in a post-COVID world, which seems to me most of the analysts are forecasting without any particular detail around the quantum of change. So yeah, it's whether that strategy, and I appreciate it's a spatial policy, but I think what I'm looking at is there are 4 sites identified for multi-storey car parks, maintaining parking spaces at current levels, and is that a sufficiently flexible approach going forward, given that there's likely to be less demand for space in the town centre and therefore less movement into the town centre in future?
Thank you, sir. I think my initial reaction is in terms of sort of supply and demand almost. If for example, there's a lot of ifs here in this post-COVID world, retail demand does come down quite a lot. Then if there isn't necessarily the demand to construct that number of spaces, I don't think an operator is going to want to do that from a sort of financial point of view. That's what I would say initially to that. Thank you.
Okay. So, but what you're saying is, at the moment, the strategy is seeking to maintain the option of at least retaining the current level of parking space within the town centre. So that is the clear strategy at the moment is to maintain the current level, but to review that in future subject to future demand. Would that be a reasonable summary of your position?
Yeah, I think that would. Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Samuel, yeah.
I think none of us know the answers to the future and the levels of parking required. I think it seems to me there's just a bit too much of a constraint about maintain in relation to actually maintaining the current levels. For example, I'm not necessarily just looking at retail, but a demand for office-related car parking. So, for instance, I don't know what the level of car parking at the moment at Suffolk County Council and Ipswich Borough Council car park is, or the Willis Faber private car park, or I think it's the old is it GRE AXA building, Eastern Electricity TXU, a multi-storey car park. There may be options there to use that to bring forward that car parking to the wider public. We mentioned about having a review of the car parking. Well, how's that review going to take place? When's it going to happen? I think it's important to raise the standards of existing car parks. The temporary car parks, with the exception of the Ipswich Borough Council car parks in Ipswich, aren't very good. So I think much of the car parking policy and strategy is to be welcomed, but I just don't see the rationale at the moment for maintaining this at current levels.
Does the council or the county council want to respond to that?
If I could just briefly in terms of, if we need to review, well, we will review in terms of the amount of parking needed if it's found, say, in this post-COVID world that there's a lot less of a demand. I mean, it will form part of the next local plan review effectively, which obviously we're obliged to do within 5 years of adoption. So I think that's the appropriate mechanism, I think.
Yeah. Can I just clarify on Mr. Clow? Yeah, sorry.
I just wanted to address the point on the office car parking standards in the centre of town. There are actually different standards. I think my colleague Christopher Fish could probably explain them better than I can. But there are lower requirements on office car parking in the town centre.
Yeah, Mr. Fish, was there anything you wanted to add?
Thank you, sir. I would note the town centre, the car parking core, of course, and the operational only policy that reflects that. I know Grafton House, the Borough Council's own car park is very much below what we would expect for an office of that size. It only has about 60 spaces. The County Council's car park is also low relative to our car parking standards, and is very well utilised as a result, and is also used for parking in support of on match days for the football club, for example. So it is already shared. I think that's. I can't comment on the other major private car parks and their utilisation other than for staff, but they would have been sized and assessed at that time when they were first proposed.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Mr. Samuel?
Yeah, I think both Ipswich Borough Council and Suffolk County Council ought to be congratulated in the ways they've been encouraging their staff to use other forms of transport. Sort of one of my point is really why can't those if Suffolk County Council and Ipswich Borough Council can achieve those lower standards, then why can't other office developments, particularly as you're going to, and it's generally accepted that there will be increased number of people working from home. So, if Ipswich Borough Council and Suffolk County Council are delivering, then why can't others?
Yeah. Mr. Clough?
Yeah, I would argue that's what the operational car parking policy is for. Apologies, I've been trying to find the number for that policy. Maybe Mr. Hammond can help me, so I can direct you to it. But I would argue that the purpose of that policy is to try and improve the standards for car parking for other organisations.
Presumably, and presumably that's part of your travel planning approach.
I would need to double check on that, but yes, sort of there's the travel plan guidance has a sort of suite of measures that you would sort of use depending on the nature and location of the development. So yes, it could be part of a travel plan.
Okay. Ms. Barker, you wanted to come in.
Thank you, Inspector. I was just going to mention that there are 3 places in Ipswich which have just won recognition for their travel planning. One is the Fred Olsen office up at White House, and the Ribbons Park development at St Clement's, and also I think Coppleston High School. So just to make the point that there are other organisations beyond the 2 councils who are making efforts through travel planning.
Yeah, okay. Mr. Clough?
Yes, just wanted to direct you to main modification 59, which has some explanation on the operational car parking.
Okay, just bear with me. So within the whole, this is the section that says within the whole IP1 area, proposals for additional long stay parking provision over and above that proposed through policy SP17.
It's the paragraph above that, sorry.
Ah, okay. Okay. Yeah. So central car parking core will be defined in the town centre through the site allocations policies development plan document. Within the central car parking core, only operational car parking will be permitted in connection with non-residential development, so that the stock of long stay parking is not increased. New non-residential long stay car parks and on-street parking will not be permitted within the central parking core. Yeah, okay. Okay. Thank you. I did then just want one further question really in relation to those specific allocations in policy SP17, just to understand them. So I presume these are allocations for parking as part of other mixed-use developments, is my understanding. Yeah.
Yes, sorry, I'm just getting the list in front of me. So yes, they are. Yes, yeah.
So if I look at modification, or suggested modification MM101, just so I can understand that. So policy with those modifications, policy SP17 now appears to support the provision of multi-storey car parks for long stay parking at both West End Road and the Old Cattle Market site. So now that's been proposed to be added into the list of sites. When it states that the provision of a multi-storey at IP, so at the West End Road, will replace both the existing surface parking at West End Road and the Old Cattle Market. So I was just, so that, yeah, effectively the sentence below the list of sites still seems to suggest that the new multi-storey at West End Road will replace both West End Road and the Old Cattle Market parking site. So it's just a question as to whether that is correct, and if so, why both new multi-stories are required on both West End Road and Old Cattle Market.
I think it needs to be borne in consideration that obviously there is now permission for the long stay car park at the Old Cattle Market on Portman Road. I believe that relates to the sentence below is about, because currently it's used as surface level car parking. So I understand it's related to that. Sorry, I probably need to, sorry, it's not fresh in my mind at the moment, so I might need to go away and think about it. But
that's okay. It just seemed to me by adding that into the list that it seems to suggest that West End Road will replace both surface level car parks. Yeah. But still there's an allocation effectively for a new multi-storey at Old Cattle Market. So that didn't seem to be maintaining the number of spaces at the existing level, but increasing. So
yeah, I think that the last part of the second sentence, if this is not replaced on site through redevelopment, is maybe that's where that's applicable.
Yeah. Yeah. Miss Barker, you're taking your hand down. Yeah, Mr. Clow.
Yeah, MM 101 came about as a part of the statement of common ground between County Council and the Borough Council. The sort of full explanation as to why we request it would be in our matter our regulation 19 statement. I'm afraid I can't quite remember what it is off the top of my head, but I think that's where all the explanation would be set out, because it was us that requested that the Old Cattle Market on Portman Road be on the list, because I think we, as Mr. Hammond said, there was a permission there and we wanted it to be recognised that the cattle market is part of that strategy. I would need to freshen my memory on it as well, I'm afraid, but I think that's where that would be set out, the reasoning behind it.
Okay. I think it's probably just one of those where I would appreciate some clarification on the effect of that change on the strategy to maintain parking levels at parking space numbers at existing levels. Yeah. Okay. So if I just have a note explaining that would be extremely helpful. Thank you. Okay. I'm going to move off of parking and back onto air quality, but this time looking at policy DM3. Okay, so we asked a question in the MIQs on air quality DM3. Is DM3 consistent with national policy in respect of the impact of new development on air quality? Question really for the council on this. I think we've covered the the extent to which policy contributes towards compliance with limit values, and I think we've covered that. I don't want to go back over that. But paragraph 181 of the framework, excuse me, paragraph 181 of the framework also expects policies to identify opportunities to improve air quality or mitigate impacts. So my question really for the council on that is looking at policy DM3, whether DM3 goes far enough in seeking to ensure that the impact of development on air quality is mitigated, and that development doesn't impact negatively on air quality, and also does it seek opportunities to improve air quality, and if so, what measures are proposed to achieve this?
Thank you, sir. I think I may just start on that, if that's okay.
That's fine.
So in terms of mitigating adverse impacts on air quality, the council are satisfied that DM3 does go far enough. It seeks to prevent the exceedance of air quality limits, and it seeks to prevent, where there is already an exceedance, any delay to bringing that zone or agglomeration into compliance with limit values. Criteria B and C, we've already looked at those. But so in terms of mitigation, yes, DM3 is considered to go far enough. In terms of improvements, the part of paragraph 181 that you referred to talks about planning policies generally, seeking opportunities to improve air quality such as through traffic and travel management and green infrastructure provision and enhancement. And so the council's position is that looking at the plan as a whole, those types of measures are already incorporated, and you wouldn't necessarily expect to see those in DM3 itself, which is a policy which is seeking to mitigate impacts. Opportunities for improvements are addressed through other policies, as appears to be envisaged in paragraph 181 of the NPPF.
Okay, thank you. Any other contributions on this policy? Mr. Samuel.
Okay, thank you, sir. If I just go back to the local plan, again, the concern is about the paragraph 9.3.1 and the focus on policy, in the sense that the focus should be on achieving the limit values. So whilst the general direction of travel in the plan is correct, we haven't seen the delivery of that, and therefore what we would like to see is that the recognition that there will be progress towards meeting those limit values. And paragraph C does say that create unacceptable risk of exposure to high levels of poor air quality, for example, through having a negative impact on an existing AQMA. But what we would be looking to see that there should be recognition that you should be working towards improving the air quality in those AQMAs. And it's just not. There isn't a date in which compliance will be achieved. So how can you measure paragraph A in the delay in assessing the delay to the date at which compliance will be achieved?
Yeah, I mean,
it just doesn't quite sort of stack up there. So without a target date, then paragraph A falls away.
Yeah, just to come back on, and I'll ask the council to come back on that, but just to come back to you on that, Mr. Samuel, I mean, would you not accept though that there are other non-development related measures that the council and the county council are and should be taking to seek an improvement in air quality? So the modal shift policies, you know, the use of greener forms of public transport. So those would be measures that could be taken outside of the development management process to improve air quality in those areas which are currently exceeding limits. And going back to a point that was made earlier, that in a sense it's difficult for development not to generate vehicles, and therefore, again, just sort of being devil's advocate on this, and therefore surely the best that could be expected is that development doesn't worsen the current situation, whilst accepting there are other measures that are being put in place to improve the current situation.
Yeah, I think the problem we have with that is that we're not actually seeing those measures to improve the current situation happening. So that's our concern. And again, going back to the air quality action plan, there are a number of measures in there, but there aren't necessarily any funding for those measures. Where is that funding coming from? We know in Ipswich Borough Council's medium-term funding plan, there isn't any funding for quality measures. Suffolk County Council, there is funding available, and there is government funding available for modal shift active lives, but that's only just starting to come forward now. So the concern that the residents have is that we haven't seen any improvements. What we have seen is the situation worsening. So without having a commitment to the targets, then we can't see it. How's it going to get better? Yeah. It's just going to strengthen it, and that will then allow better reporting, better monitoring, better targeting of measures, and implementation of the right measures in the right place at the right time.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Mrs. Robinson. You're on mute at the moment. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Can, yes.
Thank you very much. I feel quite emotional, actually. My husband's come in to say the coroner in London has issued his finding on the inquest of the young woman. She died in 2013. It's taken 7 years and great heartache and lots of work to get to this point. And I think I would like to agree with Mr. Samuel. I know this is difficult, and I know there are no easy answers, but there has to be a point at which recognition and responsibility is taken for this across the board. All I can say is I do hope you have a chance to listen to the public health representative from Suffolk County Council. I can't remember her name, Isabella, it's a double-barreled name, that spoke on the 25th, and she did a 5-minute overview, which I'm happy to pass to you because I think it's material in the light of this announcement today. And for residents, all other things put aside, air quality and public health, especially in the middle of a respiratory and COVID crisis, we have to draw a line somewhere, and I agree with everything that Mr. Samuel says. We wouldn't have been involved for the last 17 years unless we were passionate about this, and we want to see some change. And we're not blaming the borough, far from it. We're in sympathy with them because their backs are against a wall on this, and we think there has to be a collective responsibility. And the conference last week did cite others like the Planning Inspectorate and the Government and the Secretary of State. I don't know how we can move this forward in the current climate with current constraints. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Robinson. Can I ask the council to respond to that, please?
Thank you, sir. Yes, I understand that Mr. Samuel's concern, shared by Mrs. Robinson, is about the achievement of limit values, and that's what policy DM3 is aiming towards. It's aiming to ensure that there are no new exceedances, that areas that are already air quality management areas, there's no further addition to the existing exceedance, and that development doesn't prolong or delay compliance with limit values. And I understand the concern to have a time limit, as it were, to hold the council to, but the way that the air quality or the structure of the legislation work is that the responsibility ultimately lies with the Secretary of State. The UK is divided into zones and agglomerations, and compliance with limit values are measured in those zones and agglomerations, which don't always coincide with local authority administrative boundaries. And so that's why the council produces an annual air quality status report, the name of which I couldn't remember earlier, but that's it, which is submitted to DEFRA, and it's they that carry out the monitoring and assess compliance of zones and agglomerations with the limit values. I mean, I would say that the annual air quality status report that's produced by the council doesn't show a worsening in every area. There are some improvements in air quality being achieved already, and it's the council's belief that the measures in the local plan and in the air quality action plan will continue to contribute to improvements in air quality.
Yeah. Okay. Mrs. Robinson, was that a legacy hand up, or did you want to say something more?
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Thank you very much. I was thinking about this slightly differently. It almost appears as though local authorities should be granted, like a golf handicap, by the Planning Inspectorate and the Secretary of State to recognise the reality of the situation they're facing in terms of these public health crises and difficulties, and that should then trickle down to the local plan and should determine the level of sustainable development, not just in Ipswich, but in the strategic area. So I don't think the constraints are, I apologise if you hear that's not internal. I don't think that there is improvement. I don't think there are, there's evidence of measures, because the central point that I've always made, if you have an impact which you're not legally required to measure at this point in time, you have no evidence, and therefore you cannot claim improvements. It's a flawed argument, and I think this is something where people may want to take further action and further challenge on this particular issue. Maybe the Climate Emergency Committee will look at it, maybe Public Health will take ownership of this. We have NICE, we have the World Health Organization, we had Public Health England. I think they've changed their status now, but we have a mechanism to nail this and to assist the borough and the Ipswich policy people to actually deal with what I feel is the biggest public health crisis. If we're going to have development, if we're going to have a local plan delivering this level of growth, then we have to have improvements demonstrated, clearly demonstrated, and translated into how the plan is moved forward and how planning and development control and elected members finally decide, because obviously many of the current outline permissions are historic. They will be revisited for planning application. Things have moved on and reserve matters. That is the point at which we have to revisit this. So there is an imperative, I would suggest, to nail this at this point with this local plan. We can't wait for another 5 years to revisit it and be saying the same thing all over again.
But how are you proposing that that should be nailed in this local plan?
Honestly and truthfully, the aspiration of growth, both within the borough, which they have to express, and suggested by partners in the policy area, is unrealistic and unsustainable. This has always been our central argument. We started off with a local plan requiring a level of growth of 700 odd houses a year. We brought it down to 400. It should be nearer 250. That is a sustainable level. And we look to the planning inspectorate and the Secretary of State to recognise the handicaps that the borough have in satisfying legislation, planning legislation, but there's legislation outside of planning that should override that, and that we're looking to see some support for local authorities like Ipswich, support for regional areas like the policy area, and recognition of the problem. And I think it should go through the new work done by the County Council, which I welcome, and through public health. We've had no public health experts here at all during the whole of this debate on the local plan. We need experts here. We lay people, we're really struggling. We do the best we can, which I don't feel is sufficient. I don't feel like I have a command to make suggestions to the planning inspector. I'm just a layperson. But we need those experts, and we need that input to assist you with the decisions you have to make and the evaluation you have to make.
Okay. Thank you, Mrs. Robinson. Mr. Samuel, did you want to say something more?
Yeah, very quickly. Just in relation to the paragraph 9.3.1, would the council be prepared to consider adding, the wording by working towards achieving limit values? So paragraph 9.3.1 would be: the focus of policy DM3 is to mitigate the impact of development on air quality and to ensure exposure to poor air quality is reduced in the borough by working towards achieving limit values, or equivalent wording.
Councillor, want to respond to that?
So I think that's something we're happy to go away and consider.
Okay, thank you. I think if you can come back to me on that, that would be helpful. Thank you, Mr. Samuel. I'm going to move off of air quality now and move on to open space, sport and recreation. Okay. So this year's policy CS16 to begin with. And we asked a question in the MIQs: should policy CS16 apply to all developments, including those involving high density residential schemes within the IP1 area? So I just wanted to come to the council on this, and it's particularly in relation to the representations from Mersey Homes, querying the issue of addressing whether new development should be required to address or remedy existing deficits. Yeah, so it's under criterion A, policy CS 16, that development will do this by requiring all developments to, or plan will do this by requiring all developments to contribute to the provision of open space necessary for that development according to the borough's standards identified in strategic needs and existing deficits in an area. So the question really just for the council on this is, I note that that's a matter that's clarified in policy DM6, which explains that the priority for provision of space on site should be of a type to remedy existing deficits. But I think it's probably a fairly simple question, but I wonder whether it would assist the clarity of policy CS 16 if reference were made to that in criterion A. Reference were made perhaps to policy DM6, which appears to provide that clarity and understanding. It does seem to me as drafted at the moment, it could be inferred that new developments should address both the needs of the development and address existing deficits, whereas I think they do both in one. Yeah.
Yeah, and that sounds reasonable. We can go away and perhaps think about including DM6 in there to weave that in. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I think we turn to policy DM7 now, which is provision of private outdoor amenity space. And we asked a question in the MIQs, is the provision of private outdoor amenity space in all new residential developments in policy DM7 justified, effective and consistent with national policy? So clearly I note that paragraph 127 of the framework expects a high standard of amenity, and the National Design Guide sets some general guidelines on the location, privacy, function of private external amenity space. But it was just a question to the council really on what are the specific minimum outdoor private amenity space standards based as set out in policy DM7.
Thank you, sir. The short answer is they're not necessarily based on a specific guide or something like that. For example, they're standards that we've had since the 2011 local plan, and from our experience, they've been achieved on a lot of our successful developments. For example, St Clement's Gardens, the developments on there have achieved it. There's a good scheme on Bader Close. A lot of the Ravenswood developments being approved has achieved it, and I think they represent sort of a good standard of design to work towards. At the same time, they're not applied overly rigorously. For example, there's a scheme at Commercial Road, IP047, it's going to committee today, for example. The garden sizes on those properties don't meet that standard, but the policy allows that flexibility in the scenario where if it's perhaps a higher density town centre site and it's going to achieve regeneration aims, that it does sort of give and take a bit. But I guess to answer your question directly, there isn't a specific formula or it's from this particular document as such. It's just that has just worked successfully in the borough to date. So
it must have been derived from somewhere in the past then.
I mean, I wouldn't want to necessarily guess as such, but I mean, for example, the Essex Design Guide, the 2005 version, that had standards which were similar to that. However, you'll be aware, obviously, there's more recent Essex Design Guide guidance since then, but we've never said that it's going to meet those standards. So I wouldn't want to necessarily defer to that guidance.
Okay. Okay, thank you. That was all I had to ask on policy DM7. Just keeping you guessing here, we're going back to policy DM6. And this is, again, this is just really a small question of clarification for the council. So this is policy DM6 on the provision of new open spaces, sports and recreation facilities. We asked a couple of questions in the MIQs. I just wanted to come back to the second one we asked. Is the requirement in policy DM6 for the provision of open spaces, sport and recreation facilities in residential developments of 10 or more dwellings justified and effective? And it was just the basis for the threshold of 10 or more dwellings, really, on that. Again, is that relates to major development, I guess?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Thank you. So I'd like to move on to green infrastructure and the natural environment. So in terms of policy DM8 now. Yeah, and perhaps have the relevant paragraphs of the framework in front of you as well. So paragraphs 170 through to 177, I think. So I just take the two questions that we've asked on policy DM8 in the MIQs. If I take those together, so this is for the natural environment. Is policy DM8 consistent with national policy, particularly in respect of securing biodiversity net gains? And then secondly, is the proposed change to DM8 agreed with East Suffolk Council to include a reference to the recreational avoidance mitigation scheme justified? Yeah, so I know the council's justification for the policy approach to biodiversity net gain, understand that, for the suggested modifications in respect of the RAMs, cross-boundary RAMs. I think what I just wanted to turn to on this policy is the paragraph in respect of local nature reserves and county wildlife sites. So it seemed to me other aspects of the policy do link back to the relevant paragraphs of the framework. But it's just a question to the council as to whether the approach set out in the paragraph or in the policy for proposals affecting local nature reserves and county wildlife sites, whether that approach itself complies with the mitigation hierarchy in paragraph 175A of the framework. I don't think it does, but please correct me if I'm wrong.
Sorry, sir, can I just check, is your concern that this requirement is too onerous and that it prevents or seeks to prevent any development that would result in damage or loss to the local sites?
Yeah, I think it simply doesn't work through the mitigation hierarchy, does it? And I appreciate that the mitigation hierarchy is set out at the outset, but it would seem to me that it then reverts to a more stringent test for local nature reserves and county wildlife sites.
Yes, I can see that it would be slightly odd to adopt a more stringent approach to local than international and national sites.
Yeah.
Okay, I wonder if we can have a look just take that away and have a look at whether we incorporate that hierarchy or make it clear that that also refers to local nature sites.
Yeah, thank you. Mrs. Robinson, did you want to comment on that?
Please. Local sites, county wildlife sites, don't have the same protection under the legislation, formerly the EU legislation. So I think they need more protection through the local plan because they have less protection elsewhere.
Mhm. Yeah, I understand that. I guess ultimately that needs to be consistent with what's in the national framework, doesn't it? It seems to be the national framework provides a hierarchy approach towards protecting biodiversity on particular sites. So initially it talks about if significant harm to biodiversity resulting from development can't be avoided or mitigated or compensated, then planning permission should be refused. So I think it's a simple reference to that. At the moment, it purely talks about harm being mitigated, not avoided or compensated for. It seems to me there are other ways of managing that potential harm to biodiversity in those sites. Yeah.
One further point, if I may. Historically, Suffolk as a whole, East Suffolk in particular, has benefited from hedgerow surveys and on the ground surveys. Unfortunately, a lot of the areas in the borough have not had surveys. They've been subject to desktop surveys by Suffolk Wildlife Trust. They have been subjected to informal, according to the methodology of the hedgerow survey. But I think to justify why I think we need the more stringent test is because of that lack of actual data historically.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Robinson. Mr. Samuel.
Yeah, very quickly. Given the constrained nature of the boundaries of Ipswich Borough, local nature reserves probably have a higher value than perhaps elsewhere in the country. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, if I can ask the council to have a look at that section of the policy, please, in relation to national guidance. Thank you. Just a question on Plan 5. So Plan 5 at the... Sorry, Mrs. Robinson, did you want to say something more? No. Okay. Plan 5 sets out the Ipswich ecological network. I think there are some proposed modifications to that or suggested modifications to that, but I couldn't see those in the current version of the suggested modifications K7. Am I?
You're not wrong, sir. It's just a oversight on our part. We have done that work. We have updated Plan 5. It's just that I think, unfortunately, for all different mods updates, whether it got missed out, but we have done it and we can include it and provide that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Mrs. Robinson, yes. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah. Could I appreciate that lots of new documents are being uploaded on the website, but I haven't had sight of the document that was hopefully going to be sent to us yesterday in response by the council to our addendum. And secondly, I have indicated that the map that was uploaded fairly recently showing the development area still includes the site which I drew your attention to. It shouldn't be on there, it's still on there. So that map needs correcting as well. Thank you.
Was that the site at Humberdoosey Lane?
That's right, yes.
Yeah, yeah. So I think we have informally seen a suggested modification to that, and the way that would normally happen is that any modifications that are discussed during the hearings would come to the inspectors, but would ultimately be published for public consultation following the close of the hearing. So that's normally the way that would be seen. Clearly, if there are specific points that we have asked the council to respond to in your representations, then yes, by all means, we would ensure that you see a copy of their response to that. In respect of modifications that are discussed here at this stage, up until the close of the examination hearing, most of them will be included in the in the consolidated version of the modification, so you would be able to see them there. But the way forward in terms of comments on those would be following the hearing, any modifications will be published for a 6-week consultation period. Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with that.
Yes, it's just that yesterday we were offered the response by the council. I haven't managed to find it yet. Maybe it's there.
Okay. Well, we'll follow that up with the council.
Yeah. And could I just also ask a question? You asked on the previous topic about air quality what we would suggest that would be helpful. I have a one-pager. It's a diagram actually, and it's on the back of the comments I made. Would I be permitted to offer that for you just to have a view, because it kind of consolidates and makes clear what I was saying verbally. I wasn't very coherent, I'm afraid.
What form does that take? Is that a written statement?
It's an A4 diagram. It's a flow chart of the responsibilities as SOC see it, which I alluded to in what I said.
Yeah.
And sorry, there's a delay. I'm not hearing you.
You carry on, please.
Sorry, I can see you, but your responses aren't coming back through my system. It's just an A4, simple A4 sheet, a diagram which was prepared on the back of public health involvement in these matters, and it kind of consolidates what I was clumsily trying to say earlier today. Thank you.
Yeah, is that all I was going to ask? Is that something that you have included in previous representations?
No.
Sorry?
No, sorry.
It's not.
No.
Yeah. Well, I think probably the best way forward is if it's added to your statement, if it's a diagram explaining what you do in your statement, if it's added as an addendum to your statement. So let me just make sure that the council are agreeable to that.
Thank you. They've seen it before.
No objection, sir.
Okay. Thank you. I think on this one occasion, because I think you've made it clear, it does help to explain the point that you just put across, and a question that I asked you, I will make an exception, and yeah, if you can submit that, we'll ensure it's added as an addendum to your hearing position statement. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. We'll move on to policy DM10, please. Green corridors. So we asked the question in the MIQs: are the green corridors identified in policy DM10 justified and effective? Yeah, so I just wanted to ask the council on this. Council's identified a blue corridor, so blue corridor comprising the length of the rivers Gipping and Orwell. And it's referred to in paragraph 9.10.6, which talks about, it stipulates no development within 10 metres of the river. So I think that's the second to last sentence. In order to maintain an appropriate ecological buffer along the river, no development should take place within 10 metres of the river. My confusion was in that, but the next sentence then seems to say the opposite. It then says that development taking place within this buffer zone will only be permitted if. And my question really is the policy entirely clear, or the policy approach within the buffer zone entirely clear and unambiguous when informed by those two sentences? One seems to say no development, another seems to contemplate development within that 10-metre buffer.
Yeah, I think on reflection, the first sentence might be slightly too strict, perhaps. I mean, as referenced in the site sheets, for example, at Cullingham Road, the key thing is if you're within that 10 meters, you need to take account of the ecological quality of the river corridor. So perhaps we could take that away and reword it so that it mirrors that, because I do take your point that perhaps that could be taken too literally, that second to last sentence. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And the other, perhaps you can just have a little look at this when you're looking at that point. But in the policy, it's a blue corridor. In the supporting text, it's a green corridor. It might just be helpful to ensure that the terminology is the same, so that everyone's clear that we're talking about the same corridor or the same area of land. Yeah, one or the other. Or indeed it might be both, a blue and a green corridor. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Unless there's anything else on green corridors, I'd like to turn to policy DM11 on countryside, please. So we asked a question, sorry, Mrs. Robinson. Yeah.
I don't recall reading anywhere that there's a buffer on the green corridors. In the north of Ipswich, green corridors follow the road, which is already constrained, and Suffolk County Council have indicated that they may need to modify. So is that something that could be attached to the green corridors on the road systems that go out from the town?
So, sorry, I'm not entirely clear what you're referring to. Could you just run that past me again?
The green corridors, the ecological corridors, the green corridors map.
Yeah.
I don't recall anywhere in the text or on the corridor that there's any buffer zone in relation to those green corridors.
Yeah.
But those green corridors are essentially very narrow roads with hedgerows right up, which the County Council said may need modification to allow for the additional developments, for instance, Humber Duty Lane around that area.
Could the council explain that, please?
Yeah, sorry, just to clarify, it's probably not helped, again, like you said, by 9.10.6 referring to it as a green corridor, but it was a request from the Environment Agency in their consultation, and it does specifically apply to the blue corridor aspect. It's not something that the Environment Agency asked to apply to the other green corridors that go out on land, so to speak.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Does that help, Mrs. Robinson? I've lost your...
No. It doesn't really help, because what is the point of a green corridor if it's just a road? It's just going to be a strip where wildlife is slaughtered, as we're finding at the minute on Tuddenham Road. We've recorded with county wildlife and other recorders protected species that are constantly being killed along there.
Yeah,
it
so
isn't a green corridor at all.
Your concern is with the width of the green corridors and whether they're adequate or not to achieve their purpose.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. I've just asked the council to respond to that. How is that issue being addressed by this policy?
Well, the green corridor, these aren't new transport routes or new roads, for example. It's green corridors that go over, a lot of it is existing land, effectively, or existing uses. It's if an application came in on a site that happens to be within that corridor, it needs to contribute towards its function. It's not about creating a new road or anything like that, for example. Thank you.
Okay. Mrs. Robinson, you still have your hand up. Did you want to say something further on this? Mrs. Robinson,
I think the purpose of these green corridors, it's just a green line on a map. It's not serving an effective purpose. at the minute in our view.
Well, I think Ms. Baker and I should be able to take a look at some of these green corridors when we have our site visits in Ipswich. So we'll certainly take note of what you say and take a look at those. Okay. Thank you. So if we can move to policy DM11. Ms. Robinson, is your hand up for legacy reasons, or is there something further you wanted to say on that? I've lost your camera image at the moment, Mrs. Robinson, so I'm hoping, right, thank you. Communication is still there because you've taken your hand down, thank you. Okay. Policy DM11. So we asked a question in the MIQs, is the change proposed by the council to the supporting text to policy DM11 to reflect the appropriate consideration of the setting of the area of outstanding natural beauty? Is that proposed change justified and consistent with national policy? So I've now lost the reference number to that proposed change.
If I may help, sir, it's MM52, sorry, MM52.
MM52, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so adds on the setting of the INB at the end of paragraph 911.3. Yeah. So as I understand it, I think the suggested change there to 911.3, it reads as if the setting of the area of outstanding natural beauty is referred to in the definition of major development in footnote 55 of the framework. So as I read that sentence in the policy now, the definition of major development in respect to development within the ANB is defined in footnote 55 of the framework as a matter for the decision maker, taking into account its nature, scale and setting, and whether it could have a significant adverse impact on the purposes for which the area has been designated or defined, or the setting of the AONB. But the setting of the AONB isn't within the footnote 55 wording. So it does seem to me to be an addition to national policy. So I think that's the question really. Does that suggested modification effectively add to the framework footnote 55 definition of major development?
Yeah, yes, having read it in that context, yeah, I think it could be misinterpreted as a extension onto the national definition, perhaps as a compromise. Obviously, the Suffolk Preservation Society pointed out that rightly the PPG does say you should consider the setting. Perhaps it might be better to be moved to an alternative paragraph of the reason justification. So it's more of a consideration, if that makes sense, rather than part of that definition paragraph. As a suggestion, perhaps.
I think that would help. Mr. Ford, did you want to come in on that point?
I was only going to say that obviously impacts of development in the AONB themselves are one thing, but there's nothing in the MPPF that precludes you also having regard to and exactly protecting the setting of the AONB, because of course, if you're giving great weight to the conservation of the natural beauty, etc., that may also be adversely affected by unsympathetic development in the setting of the AONB. So yes, it doesn't fall within the relevant part of the MPPF, but I think it is certainly permissible, and I think the council think appropriate to include that in the policy itself, reference to protecting the setting, albeit making it clear that the test for major development applies within the AONB. Rather than to development within its setting.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And the PPG makes it entirely clear that setting the AONB is important. It's important to have regard to that. I think it was more the way it's phrased in the paragraph. It appears as if it's an addition to the footnote 55 definition of major development. So yeah, I mean, I think well, I perhaps can leave it with the council just to consider whether an alternative form of wording that perhaps reflects what's in the PPG might be helpful. So it's really on the handling of development within the setting of the AONB, perhaps as a separate statement. Yeah. Okay. Just bear with me. I have a brief message from my programme officer. That's fine. Okay. So yes, if again, such is the nature of the way my mind works, I'm afraid. I have another detailed question really about criterion C. I'm just trying to understand what that means. So major development in the countryside. Sorry, this is criterion C in the second set of criteria. May be helpful to think about the numbering or the lettering of that of those criteria, so that one isn't confused about which A, B, or C we're talking about. But the second set of criteria, major development in the countryside will only be permitted if it satisfies A to D above, and it is necessary to support rural business, is a recreational use, or is major residential development. So my question really to the council is it the intention of criterion C that major residential development in the countryside is to be allowed, even if it's not part of an allocation or required to meet the housing requirements of the borough? Because that's the way it reads to me.
It's allowed provided it meets the criteria in A to D. I'm going to ask Mr. Hammond or Miss Barker if that is the intention.
That is the intention. It's from the adopted plan, 2017 local plan. As I understand it, during the examination of that local plan, it was something that the inspector at the time requested that we effectively put in. So that's kind of where it's come from. But sorry, I don't have much more to add other than that, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Would it help if I add a bit more? Or are you happy
Yes,
to?
please. Yes, please.
I think the kind of direction of travel with the previous examination was particularly in relation to the land at the northern end of Humberdeasy Lane, which was promoted through that local plan.
Yeah.
And so the inspector at that time felt that this was a way to address that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just I appreciate that there are 4 criteria there which any major residential development would need to satisfy before it were considered to be acceptable in respect of its impact on the countryside. But it just seemed to me that does open the door for other residential development in areas of countryside. Yeah. Mr. Samuel.
It won't surprise you to hear that we objected to that amendment at the time for that precise reason. It just opens the door, and you can just see the countryside around Ipswich, the little that remains, just being eroded over time. It's just it's just going to be continuous, and we still do not like that particular paragraph.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me take that away and have a look at what the inspector said last time. Okay. Okay. I just wanted to look at policy CS2 and the suggested modification in relation to the definition of new buildings as inappropriate development in the countryside, if I may. So this was modifications suggested as a result of discussions during the Matter 2 hearing session in the first week of the examination. So I think it's MM21 is the suggested modification. Yeah. So council suggested inserting an additional criterion which effectively says the regeneration and sustainable growth of Ipswich will be achieved through regarding the construction of new buildings as inappropriate development or as inappropriate in the countryside, and exceptions being so on and so forth. Effectively the same exceptions as occur in Greenbelt policy in the framework. And my question really to the council is that definition of new buildings as inappropriate developments in the countryside, as suggested in that modification, is that well, I'm asking, is that consistent with the approach in policy DM11 with regard to major developments in the countryside? And indeed, is it consistent with national policy on development in the countryside? It did seem to me there was a degree of inconsistency between that suggested change and what policy DM11 already says, but also perhaps with national policy.
Thank you, sir. Perhaps, so sorry, I didn't actually do this modification, so sorry if I'm not overly familiar, but perhaps I do take your point. It might be easier to just cross-reference to DM11, perhaps, rather than necessarily spelling out the different buildings, perhaps. So I think my point is that perhaps again, I'm saying this a lot, perhaps we could take this away and have a look at it, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I think that the list of exceptions are akin to a Greenbelt policy, which clearly countryside around Ipswich is important, but it doesn't have the status of Greenbelt, does it? So, okay. Okay, we are, I think that completes all of the discussion of policies. I did want to have some time to just talk about the implementation and monitoring chapter. I suspect that's a discussion of more than 5 minutes. So I am going to propose that we adjourn at this point and resume at 2 o'clock. And we'll conclude with a discussion of the implementation and monitoring sections of the plan. Is that okay with, I'm conscious that both Mr. Samuel and Mrs. Robinson were keen to be part of that conversation. You're both available this afternoon at 2 o'clock? Yeah, okay. And then, yeah, Ms. Baker and I just had some concluding comments really just about next steps, just so that everyone knows where we go from here, as it were. So we'll just deal with those at the end. But yeah, if everyone's agreeable, we'll adjourn now, resume at 2 o'clock. I think the message I had from the programme officer, there you are, Annette, perhaps you can just explain to everybody what they need to do to rejoin this afternoon.
Hi, thank you, Inspector. I had sent out an invite for Matter 9 in case we did go over. So if people could rejoin using that invite, it will be easier for YouTube, etc. Thank you.
So we leave this session now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. Is that okay with everyone? Good. We'll see everyone at 2 o'clock. Thank you.